Hello, and welcome back to Anth It Up, a podcast about using anthropology to understand current social issues. I'm your host, Sarah Beth Becker, and my pronouns are she, her. No sense wasting time, so let's get right into the second episode. Last episode, I talked about a lot of things in the context of the informed consent model of gender affirming care. Part of the reason there were so many different topics was because that episode was part of my final project for a class, and it needed to contain a certain amount of information to meet the requirements. This episode will be a bit more focused, I hope. My goal for these next few episodes is to revisit some of the things I mentioned in passing in the pilot, examining each in more detail or in a new context. For example, I talked about how gender as a concept is ambiguous and unbounded, meaning it's impossible to define in perfect and exact terms. I used Veena Das's understanding of concepts and everyday ethics to make that point. I think I did a pretty good job there, but there's a lot more that can be said about gender, isn't there? Like the chair thing. Specifically, asking transphobic people online to define what a chair is as a way to show that any concrete definition of a concept, chairs and gender, will inevitably leave something important and obvious out. And that's really clever and satisfying to pull off, but it doesn't really address the core problem there. People like definitions. They want definitions. We typically enjoy knowing what other people mean when they say words. But definitions aren't easy. See the chair example again. This doesn't stop people from trying to create and control them, however, because controlling a definition is a bit like controlling what's real. There's a word for the study of what's real. It's ontology, and we'll come back to that later in the episode. But first, let's consider an ontological question, a question of what's real, that's popular amongst people who are, let's say, skeptical about trans people. Some of you might know that conservative internet commentator for the Daily Wire Matt Walsh released a documentary, heavy air quotes there, in 2020 titled What is a Woman? The documentary was a mix between segments with Walsh interviewing people, asking them to define what a woman was, and interviews with quote-unquote professionals who were opposed to a variety of trans issues, ranging from access to medical care to their very existence. Walsh is a master of generating outrage online, using the engagement that anger brings to boost his status amongst his followers. Many responses also become easy pickings for him to dunk on, since most people responding to him aren't media trained and, especially on Twitter, aren't carefully wording their responses to avoid his rhetorical traps. I'm not going to go through the documentary and tell you why almost everything that was said in it was a misrepresentation, an outright lie, or both. People far more qualified and funnier than me have already done that. I bring it up as a jumping off point. Walsh is not the first person to ask what a woman is. He won't be the last either. But before he was even born, anthropologists working within a growing feminist tradition were asking themselves the same thing. What is a woman? And, more importantly, why do they always seem to be placed lower than men on the social ladder? Anthropologists study people, right? At the core of it all, no matter what sub-discipline or theoretical turn they're working in, anthropologists are ultimately trying to understand people, the ways they live, and the worlds they create. This assumes, of course, that people exist. That probably sounds a bit silly, but it's important to emphasize. Anthropology as a discipline depends on the assumption that no matter how different a person might appear to someone else, they're still a human at the end of the day. Now, I'm not trying to imply that this assumption is wrong. My undergrad was in biochemistry and math. I know how DNA works, and I understand what scientists consider when defining a species. Humanity consists of a single species, Homo sapiens. Pour one out for all the hominids who didn't make it here with us. And that's a biological fact. An ontology, if you will. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I think it helps explain a long-running tendency in anthropology, that being the desire to search for origins. Put a pin in that. We'll come back to this point later. And with the introductions out of the way, let's start on the main body of this glorified verbal essay. For those of you who like theses, here's the one for this episode. By looking at the ways that feminist anthropologists have approached topics of sex and gender, we can better understand why a question like, what is a woman, is not only difficult to answer, but the wrong question to ask. To do this, I'll be moving through 3 seminal pieces of feminist anthropology. As for why I selected them, well, they were assigned in my History of Anthropology 2 class this past semester, so they've got that professional seal of approval in terms of their importance to the discipline. Luckily for me, they also fit this topic perfectly, and as an added bonus, I get to reuse my notes. So let's dive in with Sherry Ortner's 1972 article, is female to male, as nature is to culture. Ortner opens the article by observing that the subordination of women to men is a universal phenomenon, by which she means it's present in all known cultures. This was a bold claim to be making at the time, as feminist anthropologists typically used examples of people such as the matriarchal Crow, an American Indian tribe which currently has a reservation in Montana, as examples of cultures in which women were not subordinated to men. However, Ortner argues that even in matriarchal societies, women are excluded, be it literally or symbolically, from some of the most important places of power, political, economic, or spiritual, in every society. She points to 3 things that can prove the inferior status of women in a culture. Only one of these is needed at any point in time. 1. Elements of ideology and people's own statements that devalue women, their roles, and their place in the world. 2. Symbolism of defilement, which implies an inferior valuation, one that only applies to women. And 3. Social rules which prevent women from inhabiting places of power, interacting with those who do, or participating in a realm where power is thought to reside. Let's return to the Crow to demonstrate this. Ortner points out that there are several times, like menstruation and rituals, in which women are forced into an inferior position that prevents them from wielding the same social power as men. They're matriarchal, yes, but women are subordinate to men by not being able to take part in important rituals and by virtue of being uniquely unclean at times. Ortner dismisses arguments that women are somehow biologically inferior to men or lack something like testosterone that makes men more successful and dominant. She instead argues that the basis for women's subordination must be found in another part of the human condition. And what does she think that basis is? Well, the capacity to bear children. Her argument goes like this. All societies value culture, as in the things that humans create, over nature. This is an interesting claim to make because there are many cultures in which nature isn't considered separate from people. The very idea of man versus nature would make no sense. However, she argues that her point is still valid because those cultures still have rituals which are thought to be powerful enough to influence what we would consider nature, implying that the actions of humanity are more powerful and therefore superior in some way to nature. Nature is polluting, but culture, through ritual, is stronger. It can clean pollution. She further argues that women are seen as closer to nature than men because they're more intimately involved with species life, giving birth and nursing. This means that they're seen as inferior to men who are more closely associated with culture, the building of society. She's careful to stress that this doesn't mean that women are seen as the same as nature, rather that their close association makes them ambiguous in a way that men are not. Put simply, women are seen as closer to nature than men because they can give birth. Additionally, the fact that they can not only give birth but also lactate means they're more likely to stay home and take care of young children. Since they're more associated with nature and the home rather than culture and the public, women are invariably, literally and symbolically, subordinated to men in all cultures. Okay, that was a lot. Let's break this down. Ortner makes a lot of very bold claims here, and I'll do my best to unpack them and their implications for you now. First things first, though. If you know which famous philosopher articulated a theory of men and women that is very close to Ortner's, then congratulations, you win a prize. That prize is my respect, which I'm not sure how much that's really worth, but you've got it. And if you don't know, that's fine. The answer's going to come up later. More importantly, though, I said this episode was about how anthropology can be used to understand gender, what a woman is, and this article was about why women are oppressed, what gives. Well, some of you might have realized this, but Ortner's entire argument depends on one key assumption, that woman is a category that's roughly consistent across all cultures and is based on the ability to give birth. Now, I'm not saying that woman isn't a salient cross-cultural categorization, but that's a pretty big assumption to make up front without even saying so, right? Also, the emphasis on giving birth is striking to me, because if that's all it was, then what about infertile women? Why are they subordinated alongside those women who can give birth? Ignoring for a second that she makes no acknowledgement of transgender or intersex people, she's assuming sex is something that exists before cultural understandings of it do, that it's so fundamental to being human that it's self-obvious. Is it, though? Human bodies physically exist, sure, I'm not denying that, and there are patterns of physical traits that we interpret as sexes, male and female. But why only the two? The classification seems obvious to us, 2 different types of people separated based on their roles in procreation, but that's just because it's what we're used to. What about intersex people? You could view them as exceptions that prove the rules or errors of biology, but I find both of these viewpoints unconvincing and furthermore cruel. What's important is that both of those are value judgments. They're conscious efforts to maintain the validity of the binary sex categories. And if people have to actively rationalize away natural human bodies just because they don't fit into the two existing categories, that's a pretty good evidence to me that sex is not as pre-cultural as some people would like to believe. Sex is only understandable in specific cultural contexts, the same way that gender is, and even things that seem self-obviously connected to specific sexes are the product of cultural norms and beliefs. At the very least, I don't think it's pre-cultural enough to be the basis for women's supposed universal subordination by men. A part of it? Perhaps. Probably, even, but gender has never been as binary as modern Western society likes to believe for this to be the only reason. Okay, so women probably aren't universally subordinated to men because they're closer to nature because they can give birth. It's an interesting argument, sure, but it takes too many things for granted. Several great points here, but overall not good enough for me. I haven't even talked about all of the things that Ortner assumes yet, and I will talk about a few more, but first, let's move on to the next article. Gail Rubin's 1975 article, The Traffic in Women, Notes on the Political Economy of Sex, is another one of those absolute classics of feminist anthropology. Drawing on Marxist theory, Levi-Strauss's theories of kinship, and even Freudian psychoanalysis, she advances her own argument for why women are universally subordinated to men. Indeed, her starting point is the same as Ortner's. Her ending point, though, is completely different. Rubin starts by looking at how Marxist feminists have understood gender so far. She argues that they've done an excellent job of explaining how the gender division of labor and accompanying gender roles that exist today help maintain capitalism. If you haven't heard this before, housework, that is, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, and everything else traditionally considered woman's work, is labor the same way that going to work in a coal mine is labor. It is work that is essential for the continuation of society, and it's done for free by women, so, and here's the important part, men can dedicate even more of their time to laboring, the production of capital. And while this is an important revelation, Rubin wants a little more from Marxist feminist theory. She wants a universal explanation, something to account for the fact that women were subordinated long before capitalism rolled around. To do this, she turns to a relatively recent development in gender studies, the idea of a sex-gender system. Rubin defines this as the set of arrangements by which a society transforms biological sexuality into products of human activity and in which those transformed sexual needs are satisfied. So a few things to note immediately here. By biological sexuality, she means the human desire to have sex, not necessarily heterosexual sex, at least as we understand that today. Rubin actually thinks that all people are born bisexual. She's also drawing a line between the brute facts of biology, a fun quote from the article, and human social activities and roles, the same way that we typically separate sex and gender today. But she's placing sexuality as the reason for the creation of genders. So Rubin's whole argument here is that women are suppressed as an inevitable result of the creation of genders. Essentially, she argues, much like Claude Levi-Strauss argues that there's a universal human taboo against incest, that there is a taboo against the sameness of men and women for the purposes of ensuring that marriage occurs, and that the smallest viable economic and social unit is one man and one woman. It is this taboo that creates gender and, by virtue, sexuality. Because if something must be made taboo, then it must have been a valid option in the first place. She argues that the fact that the incest taboo made some heterosexual relationships forbidden implies that non-heterosexual relationships were already forbidden, or, in other words, the sex-gender system enforces certain forms of heterosexuality. A brief tangent on kinship, mostly because it's essential to Rubin's argument, but also because it's interesting. Anthropologists understand kinship as a system of relationships that are allowed in a society. These relationships might reflect what we consider to be biological relationships, but not necessarily. They're also not consistent across cultures, with who is considered a relative and what kind of relative they are differing heavily. This is important because Levi-Strauss's incest taboo is not universal in the sense that it's exactly the same across all cultures. Rather, it takes on specific forms according to the kinship patterns present, in a sense forming those very kinship patterns. In the same way, Rubin's taboo against sameness doesn't imply that all sex-gender systems will end up identical, and she doesn't say that. In fact, she's quite emphatic that it's the suppression of inherent similarity that causes gender to form, not the expression of inherent difference. Furthermore, while the development of gender is closely tied to sex, it's not completely bound by it. She gives a few examples to illustrate her point here, like the Azande. A young Azande man of sufficient wealth could take a boy as his wife by paying the appropriate bride wealth while he waits to come of sufficient age to have a woman wife. While the boy is not converted to a woman by the transaction, he is made into a wife. The Mojave people have a ritual in which a man can become a woman and vice versa through a special ceremony. After this, they'd be the opposite gender in every aspect of their lives, including in marriage pairings. So just to summarize all that, women are suppressed as a side effect of the creation of a sex-gender system. The system is created in order to enforce heterosexual marriage pairings, but that heterosexuality is dependent on gender rather than sex, meaning pairings that appear homosexual based purely on sex are considered heterosexual. If you're wondering why the creation of such a system requires one side to be oppressed, well, that's in part due to the tendency of systems to resolve into hierarchies, and partly because the sex-gender system requires the suppression of specific traits to work. This is where the Freudian psychoanalysis comes in. I'll spare you the details here, in part because I don't think Freud's theories are empirically sound, and this episode is already long enough without a rant about Freud, but here's the gist of it. The development of a gender identity is not a natural, inevitable process, but a violent one in which children are taught to identify with their mother or father as appropriate and to suppress those traits that do not align with their assigned gender role. When I say violent, I don't mean that children are beaten when they don't act as desired, though they certainly might be. Violence here refers to the psychic damage that this process of socialization requires, a devaluation of certain parts of the self, and trauma from separation from things and people, often mothers in the case of boys, that were previously considered dear to them. So that's it for the summary there, and honestly, I encourage people to go read this one themselves, because Rubin makes a lot of very interesting arguments in so much detail that I just can't go over it all here. But for now, let's do some analysis. Right, so the first thing that you might notice is that Rubin's argument is very functionalist. That is, she describes things in terms of what they do. Why do we have gender? It enforces heterosexuality and heterosexual marriage pairings. It doesn't really tell you where the system came from in the first place. Rubin is specifically making a structural functionalist argument, which means that she's talking about structures in terms of their function, as just a vocab term for you. Functionalist arguments often don't take into account the historical development of things like those structures. They're considered primarily in terms of what they do now, which is partly what makes this such an interesting paper. Rubin is using structural functionalism to argue against the structural functionalism of the then current Marxist feminists. So returning to our thesis for a minute here, Rubin considers gender to be the product of violence, a system to ensure heterosexual pairings. To oversimplify a bit, then, a woman is a person who makes up the subordinated half of a heterosexual pairing. Obviously, there are exceptions, such as when boys are taken as wives when women are not available, but the fact that these boys are treated as wives preserves the masculinity of their husbands. That's important because in true Levi-Strauss structuralist fashion, women are the opposite of men, one only understandable in the context of the other. Think light and dark, concepts that are understood as the absence of the other, the things they are not. I haven't talked about the ending of these two articles yet, and for good reason. Ortner and Rubin weren't just writing for scholarly thrill or the enrichment of academia. Like so many anthropologists, and indeed scientists in general, their work embraced the political context of the day, and the question on feminist minds at that point was, and in some ways still is, what can be done about gender inequality? You see, the mainstream argument at the time was, and again, more or less still is, that women were naturally inferior to men, weaker, less capable, prone to either flights of fancy or too cold and calculating, depending on which culture you come from, and their subordination, therefore, was both natural and good. Ortner and Rubin were both directly arguing against this idea, trying to prove that the subordination was not natural and things don't have to be this way. In short, they're both arguing against biological determinism. That's why at the end of their articles, they each make an argument about what should be done. Ortner, locating the oppression of women and their association with nature due to their ability to give birth, argues that the solution is to recognize that women's biology does not make them inherently inferior, and to give them full rights to the societal positions and activities previously monopolized by men. Rubin, on the other hand, calls for the absolute abolition of gender, but not sex. She's very clear on that. Since the sex-gender system and its compulsory heterosexuality inevitably subordinates one side of the system, it's best to get rid of it entirely. Two different solutions, and not compatible ones either. It is easy to see how both authors came to their conclusions, though. I'm not sure I agree with either of them. For one, Ortner's suggestion just continues to emphasize that men are the one doing important, valuable things and that women should want to be like men. I'm not saying that opening up the domains of men to women is a bad thing, but unless that's paired with a recognition of how important work that's traditionally considered women's fare is, we haven't really solved anything. We've just ensured that those women who don't want to get involved with the quote-unquote public will continue to be looked down on. Rubin's argument, while radical, just doesn't seem super realistic to me. For one, her assumptions that there are only two genders whose specifics vary across culture just isn't true. Many cultures have third genders that aren't considered men or women. For example, some two-spirit people fit this category. Now, there's a lot more that can be said about the inevitability of structures leading to hierarchy, definition as absence, and binary systems. But really the most pressing thing is, in my experience, that people tend to like their genders, at least when they can express it in a healthy and fulfilling way. Men, women, NBs, and all the other categories too numerous to list here like having their gender and expressing it. Even agender people get something out of its absence, because gender can't be absent if it doesn't exist. Getting rid of gender entirely just isn't going to happen, at least not anytime soon. There's another problem with these articles that I haven't mentioned yet. Both of these authors are writing against modern understandings of women's subordination as natural by using cross-cultural examples of difference and similarity. So far, so good. One small problem. These example cultures are implicitly cast as more primitive or ancient than our own. If you want to demonstrate the roots of something, you have to go back to those roots. These non-capitalist modern-day groups were taken as indicative of what was present far back in the past, showing what we might have developed from. This is intensely problematic, and it's a problem the discipline has had for a long time. In short, no group of people alive today, or even then in the long ago times of the 70s, were less evolved or less developed than Western society at the same time. We are not the pinnacle of human evolution and development. We are just one path taken by humanity amongst many. They are not artifacts of the past, unchanging crystals of what once was. They are living societies that underwent as much, if not more, change over time than we did. Technological sophistication does not equal supremacy, and our achievements, as wonderful as they are, aren't proof that we've developed more. To use these people as evidence of what our past might have looked like completely sidesteps the fact that they aren't our past. The environmental, political, and economic circumstances of today, which affects these groups as much as us, aren't the same as what existed then. This sort of cultural evolutionist rhetoric, which Ortner and Rubin aren't so much as espousing as dabbling in as a side effect of the kind of arguments they're trying to make, is deeply racist. And I do think it weakens both of their arguments since they're not as historically rooted as they first seemed. However, even before we move on to the third and final article, which will shake things up a bit, I think there is something worth taking away from each of these articles right now. Namely, evidence that the subordination of women is not natural. Despite each of the article's flaws, they both do a good job of showing how gender differences are created by the actions of human, not nature. You can make a compelling argument to someone based on Ortner and Rubin's work, especially if they think that native peoples that survive to the present are somehow more primitive than Western culture, and that's important. Part of effective communication is understanding what evidence your conversation partner is going to accept, even if you personally think that evidence is weak. Let's step back a bit with a quick example. Some of you might remember CPAC this year, in which conservative commentator for the Daily Wire, gosh, they seem to show up a lot, Michael Knowles went on stage and called for the eradication of transgenderism, and then acted shocked and appalled when people correctly understood him as calling for the genocide of transgender people. In one of his many responses to the fallout of his speech, Knowles said in a video that, quote, "Transgender people is not an ontological category. It's not a legitimate category of being." Now, my first thought here was, oh, that's cute. Knowles knows what ontology is. My second, equally unproductive thought was, who died and put you in charge of ontology? You know, you don't just get to say that something is ontologically real or not. You kind of got to back that claim up. More seriously, Knowles is arguing here that transgender people are not ontologically real, by which he means that they're just delusional. I'm using Knowles as an example because he's literally paid to be bigoted and wrong about issues like this. He is paid to ignore evidence to the contrary, which he has done numerous times, and to advance conservative talking points without engaging in honest debate. He's good at it too. There's a reason he was invited to speak at CPAC. But his audience isn't getting paid, and they might be responsive to evidence if it's presented in the right way. So what can we say to Knowles' claim here? Well, a lot of things, but a start would be to point out that gender norms differ across cultures, and per Ortner and Rubin's articles, aren't natural. You could either pick Ortner's article or Rubin's article, or even use both to explain how even quote-unquote natural differences in the sexes are so filtered through social norms and conventions that they take on completely new meanings, often contradictory ones from culture to culture. The point here is to show that the ontology of gender is not as cut and dry as it appears and differs heavily across cultures. And if it differs this much, then the binary genders might not be as ontologically absolute as Knowles would like. At the very least, you'd have to allow for several ontologies, and at that point, you acknowledge the possibility for change. Even if being transgender wasn't an ontologically real category in the past, there's no reason why it can't be one now. As much as I'd love to keep examining Knowles' claims, we have one more article to get through, so let's do that. Don't worry, won't be going in nearly as much depth with this one, but if you read any of the three today, make it Michelle Rosaldo's 1980 article, The Use and Abuse of Anthropology, Reflections on Feminism and Cross-Cultural Understanding. The article starts out by reaffirming some of the points seen in Ortner and Rubin's articles, namely the seemingly universal cross-cultural subordination of women. However, Rosaldo doesn't stay with this viewpoint for long. Instead, she begins to critically examine the assumptions undergirding these articles, some of the very things we've discussed so far, and the ways that anthropology tries to render women's agency. You see, before writing this article, Rosaldo wrote articles similar to what Ortner and Rubin wrote. Her focus was on the division between the public and the private, and how that division contributed to the subordination of women. You might recognize this as an important theme in Ortner's article in particular. However, she now questions the importance of that division, especially in cross-cultural contexts. She goes on to discuss how the idea of a sharp division between the public and the private, society and the home, is not so much of a cultural constant as it appears. The reason it feels obvious, intuitive to her and us is because it's a cultural norm. It matches our pre-existing biases. Remember that question I asked earlier about the philosopher? Well, Rosaldo actually mentions him. Plato is famous for arguing that the pursuits of the mind are superior to the pursuits of the flesh. He explicitly held up men as superior to women because they are less tied to the flesh than women are, specifically because women give birth. This is Ortner's argument, and it's telling she didn't mention Plato at all in her article. Instead, the relationship between nature and culture, the flesh and the mind, were taken for granted because they conformed to her pre-existing biases. It's a conclusion that she started at, rather than one she worked towards. And these assumptions are not small ones. They form the basis of Ortner and, to a degree, Rubin's entire argument, the idea that there must be a division of labor between the public and the home, that there is always recognized a separation between nature and culture, are too significant to be recognized as confirmation bias and still leave the original arguments intact. So what should we do? What can we do? I'm going to read a section of Rosaldo's article here because there's no way I could possibly say this better than her. The search for origins reveals a faith in ultimate and essential truths, a faith sustained in part by cross-cultural evidence of widespread sexual inequality. But an analysis which assumes that sexual asymmetry is the first subject we should attempt to question or explain tends almost inevitably to reproduce the biases of the male social science to which it is, quite reasonably, opposed. These biases have their basis in a pervasive, individualistic school of thought that holds that social forms proceed from what particular persons need or do, activities which, where gender is concerned, are seen to follow from the givens of our reproductive physiology. And so, for feminists and traditionalists alike, there's a tendency to think of gender as, above all else, the creation of biologically based differences which oppose women and men, instead of as the product of social relationships in concrete and changeable societies. The solution, then, Rizaldo argues, is to stop searching for universals, to stop searching for origins. Besides the fact that the data we need to truly locate the origins of gender inequality is quite literally lost to time, these efforts ultimately just reaffirm pre-existing cultural biases and don't reveal as much about the human condition as they claim. Instead, it's better to focus on individual cases, understand the local histories that lead to specific forms of gendered relationships in specific places. To do so can help decenter Western assumptions about social structure and values and reveal what's actually happening. This is, as Rizaldo admits in the article, really difficult to do. Anthropologists love explaining things. I made an entire podcast so I could explain things. But we really like trying to explain why humans are the way they are. Gender and equality are no exception. Not to mention, those assumptions I just talked about are seductive precisely because they feel so natural. Working within the Western intellectual tradition predisposes you to them. Nevertheless, by actively recognizing that universal definitions aren't feasible or, at the very least, are always based on some inherent cultural bias, anthropologists can produce scholarship that not only better reflects the people they study, but is more informative too because it's freer of those restricting assumptions. Non-anthropologists can take something away from this as well. The warning against universals isn't just for academics. Too often, we demand in our daily lives perfect answers to complex metaphysical or ontological questions. What is a woman? Well, to define that on biology alone is too restrictive and will always leave out someone who is obviously a woman, and to define that universally on social roles alone also doesn't work. Those aren't consistent across cultures. There is no universal, perfect definition of what a woman is, nor is there one for what a man is, or what a non-binary person or any gender identity is. Any definition will have exceptions and caveats be based on some assumption that's itself based entirely in a cultural norm rather than a universal truth. This doesn't mean that gender is meaningless, though. It obviously holds a great deal of importance to people. If gender had no meaning, trans people wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be a need to transition. So, my answer to the question is anyone who says they're a woman is a woman. It's really that simple. And this might seem unsatisfying. It's far from a grand answer and sort of feels like a cop-out. And we could construct a definition of womanhood based on cultural norms, viewing it as the product of specific relationships with other people, places, and things. And provided we did a good enough job of data collection and analysis, we'd get a pretty good answer as to what being a man or woman is in a given culture. But all we've really done there is construct a model of what men and women are typically considered to be. And, like all models, it'll never perfectly represent reality. It would be useful for understanding societal-wide structures and patterns, but that's all it is. Explanatory. Interpretive. Real people will always push its boundaries or transgress them on purpose. And if you reject them as not really the gender they say they are, then you're doing the same thing as Michael Knowles, mistaking convention and models for ontology. We can do better. Rizaldo certainly believed we could. At the very least, we can avoid the folly of trying to perfectly define a chair. Hey, thanks for joining me in this episode of Anthed Up. Today we talked about some significant works of feminist anthropology and what insights they could offer to our modern society struggling with the issue of how to define genders. We looked at Shelley Ortner's arguments against biological determinism, instead placing the subordination of women and their association with nature rather than any inherent weakness. Gail Rubin's arguments against the naturalness of heterosexuality and being cisgendered were next. She pointed the finger for women's oppression and compulsory heterosexuality at specific social structures designed to create both. We also examined why both of these arguments are flawed, based on assumptions that are convincing because they reaffirm our existing biases. However, they can still be useful despite these flaws, especially when trying to convince people who do believe in those assumptions. Finally, we looked at Michelle Rizaldo's response to this kind of scholarship, recognizing that although the desire for a perfect universal answer is tempting, those answers will always be flawed. Instead, we should try to understand local forms as they are without imposing external assumptions on them and learn to be comfortable with the ambiguity that comes with this. That's it for me today. Next episode will probably be about medicalization unless I'm suddenly inspired by a different topic, which is what happened with this one. I'll also be aiming for a shorter episode, but we'll see how that goes. I'm known to be wordy. Drop a like and a follow if you enjoyed this episode. A link to the sources will be in the description, and follow me on Twitter at S+B². Thanks again for listening. Be kind to one another, and remember to anth it up.